Good evening and welcome back. Thanks for joining week 2 of our faculty presentations. If you missed week 1, I would encourage you to check out our admitted student site for recordings of all of these sessions from last week. My name is Topher Bordeaux. I'm an Associate Director of Admissions at Dartmouth, and you may remember me from last week's sessions. If you do, you know that I am not the person you are here to see tonight. That would be Lisa Baldez. Lisa is a professor of government, Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean studies here at the college. And she is going to share some of her work on gender representation on legislative bodies around the world and what that means as an indicator of gender equality in each society. As always, she'll present for about 20 minutes, and then we will open up for questions, either through the Q&A or through the raised hand function. Either one is cool. We'll get to as many as we can. And a little twist tonight, before Lisa presents and takes your questions, she has 3 questions for you. I'm going to launch the polling function here in just a moment before I share my screen with Lisa. And we'd like everyone to complete the poll. It'll take you about 1 minute and it's anonymous. And we think it'll help inform the presentation tonight.
Great. I'm so excited to be with you guys tonight. Thank you, Topher, for asking me to speak to the new 24s. All right, so let's take a look at what you guys had to say. So the first question, women make up what percentage of the world's legislators? 21% of you said 5%, half of you said 10%, 26% said 25%, 1% said 45%, and nobody guessed 75%. Which country has the highest percentage of women in legislative office? 1 of you said Mexico. 74% of you, that's 3/4 of you, said Sweden. 3% guessed Palau. 22% guessed Rwanda. And 2 of you had the United Arab Emirates as the top number. The third question, what place does the United States hold in the global ranking of women in legislative office? And this is out of about 188 countries. So 4% of you guessed position number 5, 7%, 10, 31%, 25, the 25th position. About 1/4 of you guessed position 50, and then the winner there was 32% saying that the US is in 75th place in the global rankings. So those are great guesses, and I'm going to ask you to keep in your mind your own answer. And while we do that, I'm just going to talk about what the data actually show. All right. Let me split my screen there. Okay. So what we're looking at here is data from the Interparliamentary Union. They gather data on the world's legislators. And here they keep careful track of the number of women in parliament. And so you can see this is really recent data as of March 1st of this year. And if we scroll down here, you have the total number of members of parliament in the world, that's 38,000. We know the gender breakdown for every single one of those members of parliament. And 9,683 of those are women, or exactly, that's the lower house. If we take the lower house and the upper houses combined, it's exactly 25%. So 1/4 of the world's legislative seats are held by women. Let's turn to the second question. This is a world ranking as of, again, of March 1st of 2020. And here we have a number from 1 to 10. So you can see the name of the country, its rank, when the most recent election was held, the number of seats in the upper and lower chambers, and the percentage of women. Number 1, Rwanda in first place, 61.25. I'm not sure about the 0.25 percentage of the legislators in the lower house in Rwanda are women. So Rwanda holds the number 1 spot. And if we look at the top 10, it's a really interesting mix of countries: Rwanda, Cuba, Bolivia. There's United Arab Emirates. I have to say, I have been following these data for a long time. United Arab Emirates has never been on the top of this list, and that is something very new as of October of 2019. So I definitely want to know what's going on with the UAE. Mexico, it's really close here. 48% of the parliamentarians in Mexico. Nicaragua, there's Sweden. followed by Grenada, South Africa, and Andorra in the 10th position. Now, the third question was, what's the percentage of, what's the ranking that the United States holds in this list? So let's scroll down. So those of you who guessed 5 and 10, you know you're wrong. 15. Usually if we were teaching a class, I would say, stop me when you see it. But I already know what the answer is. So we've gone past 50. 50 is held by Trinidad and Tobago. 30% of their legislators are women. 75. And actually, the answer is not an option that was available on your poll. The United States is in 81st place in the world rankings in terms of the percentage of women in Congress, with currently in the House of Representatives, 23.49% of the members of Congress are women. So let's, that's the data. And let me just go back to just me. So think about what you answered in the poll and what the data actually showed. And those data are very, very recent. And you see the answers to two questions that are really important questions of study in political science that have been so for about the last 20 years. And those two questions are, one, why so few women relative to men? What explains the gap between the percentage of women and the percentage of men? And then the second question, what accounts for cross-national variation? So what puts Rwanda in first place in the United States and 81st place, and what moves United Arab Emirates up from basically toward the bottom of the list up into the top 10? So these are questions that are really important fundamental objects of study within political science. They're questions of study that I've devoted part of my research to. And ordinarily, I talk about this in several of the classes that I teach in the government department at Dartmouth, when we talk about women in legislative office as an aspect of the ways in which gender is relevant to politics around the world. I teach classes on gender and politics in Latin America. I teach classes on gender and politics in the United States. And occasionally I'll teach a course from a transnational or international perspective, covering lots of different countries. For that Latin America class, you see that several of the countries in the top 10 are Latin American countries: Cuba, Mexico, and Nicaragua, at the least. So when you answered those questions, you may have done it completely at random. But my sense is, from the kinds of answers that you gave, that you had some kind of working assumption or intuition about what the right answer to those questions was. For example, 75% of you guessed that Sweden would be in the top position in terms of the percentage of women in office. And there's a hypothesis in that is a guess about Sweden as a country. And what are the kinds of characteristics and qualities of Sweden as a country that made you guess that there is a higher percentage of women in office in that country? And generally, Sweden and the other Nordic countries are generally considered to be, and are, in most cases, higher than most countries in terms of that percentage, as well as other indicators in terms of the status of women. And those are hypotheses. And the research in political science would take those hypotheses as starting points and then subject them to empirical testing to gather data to start to understand what are the answers to those questions. So let me just talk through what we do know so far about what explains cross-national variation, what accounts for the position of Rwanda at number 1 in the United States at number 81, et cetera. So there's 3 sets of hypotheses that I'm going to talk through. And one of them has to do with what I said about Sweden, the kinds of characteristics of particular countries in terms of what kind of political system do they have? What's the level of socioeconomic development that a particular country has? Does a country have a kind of culture or history of egalitarianism? And that's one of the things that leads people to guess the Nordic countries and puts them at the top. How religious is a particular society? Now, when I started to read about women in political office in the 1990s, when I started to do my doctoral research, it was widely assumed that countries in Latin America would never have high rates of women in legislative office. And the reason for that was because Latin America was considered, it was at that time a largely Catholic region. Most of the countries in the region were predominantly Catholic. And Catholicism was seen as a force that was an obstacle to gender equality. In the 4 decades that have passed, so 3 or 4 decades that have passed since then, in fact, almost immediately after I finished graduate school, Latin American countries began making major changes and now are some of the top countries in the position in that list. So religiosity is something I take with a grain of salt. I don't necessarily consider that to be a strong factor, and the research on that will back me up. A second set of characteristics or second set of factors or hypotheses that political science scientists have identified as really helping to understand what explains the cross-national variation is things that have to do with individual women's decisions. There's some research on women in the United States that actually shows that women are more likely to run for office if they are asked to run. So if someone close to them or someone in a position of power says, hey, you know, I've been watching your work in the student government, and I think that you should think about running for office. There's something about that invitation to run that changes women's calculus to a greater extent than it does for men. And that has been, there's really strong results in that in terms of survey research and empirical research on the status of women. So that's one thing about individual women's decision-making. I was just today reading some very fresh research that looks at the ways in which family responsibilities and exactly the degree to which family responsibilities interfere in women's decisions making, or affect women's decision making about running for office, and has some pretty counterintuitive results. But really the factor that has the most explanatory power, that is, explains the most of the variation across the cases, is what we call institutional rules, especially the rules governing elections. So an electoral system, whether or not a country has a proportional representation system in which seats are allocated in terms of the percentage of votes that a particular party wins, or whether they have the size of the district, of an electoral district. You can imagine in the United States, the electoral district size is 1 generally. In other countries, the size of an electoral district can be as many as 200. So if you have 200 representatives in a particular district, it's easier to imagine how more of them might be women. But the real reason, and what's really driving the variation, is the presence of what are called gender quota laws. And gender quota laws are laws that require a certain percentage of candidate spots to go to women. And almost all of the countries in the top 10 and most of the countries in the top 50 have some kind of gender quota law in place. Rwanda has a law that requires 50% of all candidates to be women. Mexico has a law in place that effectively, the way the law is written, is a law that we call it a parity law, that puts 50% of women in electable spots in legislative elections. There are other countries where individual political parties have laws or have norms or regulations that are voluntary measures aimed at increasing the percentage of women. But this change, starting in the middle of the 1990s, is really what aims to explain this variation. Now, there's another question about where do the gender quota laws come from? In fact, where do the gender quota laws come from? How are those laws designed? How are they implemented? And what impact do they have is in itself a subject of research in political science. And I've done quite a bit of that research on countries in Latin America. I teach whole courses on this, and I've done research on this, and I can talk about it at length, but I'm just going to close up this formal part and then open up for your questions by mentioning a couple of questions that you might have, or that this data and the way I've presented it might raise for you, that are different from the kinds of questions that I've explicitly focused on. one of those questions is, what difference does it make? So why would it matter that a woman versus a man is elected to legislative office? And there's research on that as well. That's an area of very active research activity within political science and the other social sciences, trying to look at the impact of having a woman in office on the kinds of bills that are introduced, the level of success of certain policies passing. There's a bunch being done now that looks at the impact of having a woman in office on the career ambitions of young women and girls. Another question, what about people who don't identify as either a man or a woman? All of this research that I've talked about, most of it to date so far, presumes people identifying either as a man or as a woman. There's new research coming out that looks at candidates who do not identify along gender binaries, and increasing numbers of LGBT candidates getting elected to office worldwide, and that's a really active research agenda as well. There's also a question about how important it is to elect women to office. For some people, this may feel like something they care deeply about, and they want to see the percentage of women increased. That there's a sense that women do make a difference in various ways. And so that's something that they kind of feel strongly about and think is very important. But others may think, yes, that's important to me to have women in elective office, but it might be more important to have someone who is familiar with a particular policy area, who comes to office with, for example, with an expertise in healthcare, or an expertise in medicine, or in transportation policy, or is the ethnicity or the ethnic identity of that person, or the racial identity might matter to them more than gender, or their socioeconomic status. They might want to have people from working class backgrounds or poor backgrounds being represented in the halls of Congress, might be more important to them than being a woman. Or it may not matter to people, and it's just simply what ideas and what policies they bring to the table, or the fact that they represent their constituents particularly well by knowing the people in their particular electoral districts. So there's lots of questions that just this data, this one source of information that I've shown you, can raise. And these are the kinds of questions that we routinely look at in classes in gender and politics and political science at Dartmouth and in the rest of the country. So I'm going to stop there. I don't know whether there are any questions have been posed, but I invite you to ask questions, and we'll take a look at them, and we'll probably take some from the floor. While you're thinking about your questions, I'll just talk a little bit about the research that I'm doing today and the research that I'm doing lately. I have been doing research on international human rights treaties, and particularly the International Women's Rights Treaty, which is a treaty at the United Nations called the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. It's known as CEDAW internationally. And I'm looking at I started out by looking at why the United States is one of just a handful of countries that hasn't ratified this treaty, what impact that treaty has on the countries where it has been ratified, and whether or not that's something the United States might want to consider. So that's some of the things I've been looking at so far, or more recently. So let me take a look at some of these questions.
Sure. I thought Nathan had a really interesting question. And so I'm going to hope that he's willing to ask it live. So just let me find Nathan's name. Here he is. Nathan, I'm going to unmute your microphone and go for it.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Hi. So I was wondering, what would a gender quota law look like in a non-parliamentary democracy, and what would it look like in the United States?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really difficult to imagine a gender quota law being applied to legislative elections in the United States for a couple of reasons. One, as I mentioned, we have single member districts. So a quota law being applied to candidates, each political party would have only nominates one candidate per office. And so requiring, you can't really divide that up. You can't make a certain percentage of that one seat be women. So it's difficult to imagine. There's also a lot of, even if it were imaginable, there's a history of the use of the term quota that has a really negative valence to it. So while gender quotas is a term that have been embraced in many countries around the world, the United States, because of our political history, beginning with Jewish quotas in the beginning of the 20th century that were used to limit the admission of Jewish students to colleges, quota has it has a negative valence to it, so that we'd have to think about how we might want to talk about such a policy. The third thing is that we actually do have one form of quotas remaining in the United States. It was implemented in 1920 after the extension of the suffrage, and that is that the Democratic Party has a quota of 50% for members of the Democratic Convention each year, or every 4 years. So the people who are delegates to that convention, 50% of them have to be women. And that's something that's been with the Democratic Party for a very long time. So it is possible to imagine political parties. Oh, the other aspect, of course, is the primary system. In a primary vote where the decision about who gets to run as candidates is up to the voters, it's difficult to impose a primary. In countries where the leaders of political parties choose candidates, it's much easier to imagine political parties appointing a certain percentage of women as candidates rather than waiting for the results of a primary election where you can't dictate those results in advance. Great question, Nathan.
Cool. There was a hand up, but I think it went down. So, oh yeah, Ariel, I think you had your hand up, and I'm going to unmute your microphone if you'd like to ask Lisa your question. You there, Ariel? Okay, while we're waiting for her, I think Ron Peters had an interesting question. Given the egalitarian nature of Scandinavian countries, does the data indicate that when given the choice or opportunity, women choose not to run for and hold office? I do not prefer to, yes, that was Ron's question, if we could get that answered.
Okay, so that's a cool question, and that's the kind of question some of you are asking about. Somebody asked, how do you do this kind of research? Is this the kind of research that students could get involved in? And here's the thing. That perspective, that question is taking an assumption about Scandinavian countries and something I mentioned to you about research that's been done in the United States, but to my knowledge has actually not been done in countries around the world. It's only just beginning to be done to ask women more surveys about political ambition or intention to run for office. So I don't know the answer because I don't think that research has been done on that question. So that suggests that there is kind of room to maneuver, room for a new research project in there. And that's the kind of project where you can imagine doing a survey of women in particular countries. You could design a survey. Surveys are relatively easy to do online these days, in-person interviews. Of course, now at the very particular moment that we're in, that would be the only way to do the kind of research that you're envisioning or that you're suggesting there. So I'm just going to highlight that as an opportunity for future knowledge that we really don't know that much about so far.
I see Serena Knight has her hand up. Serena, I'm going to unmute your microphone and go ahead and ask Lisa.
Sure. Thank you so much, Professor. I had a question about the chart. And so given the fact that many of the top 10 countries in the world that have the most representation of women in government are considered part of the global south or are developing nations, do you think that there are many major correlations between the representation of women in government and the status of the economic development of that country?
That's a great question. You frame it in terms of those, what you see as a common point among those countries as they're from the global south, which suggests kind of a shared history or some common historical markers of maybe shared experience of colonialism, developing country status. But I think really in that case, the most important variable is relatively recent transition from an authoritarian government to democracy. And in the Latin American countries, which are the countries that I'm most familiar with the exception of Cuba, which I'm going to asterisk for just a second, Countries like Mexico and Nicaragua have gender quotas because at a time when that country went through, when Mexico became more formally democratic, when Nicaragua went through a transition from socialist rule to a more formal democratic rule, that's the point at which women involved in politics and the women's movement began to pressure for the adoption of gender quotas and for increase in the number of women in elective office. So it's that experience of undergoing political regime change and transition that was paired with pressure from women's movements to adopt change in how elections were run, to make them more representative and to have the governments reflect more. Women are 50% of the population, to have them reflect their population more significantly than they had in the past. That's a great question and great observation. Let me just say one thing about Cuba. Cuba has been, the Cuban government, the socialist government in Cuba has been in place. There's been some reforms to it recently, but basically the system of government that's in place now is the system of government that was in place when the revolution took place in 1959. So what you see in Cuba, the number 2 position of Cuba in that chart is not the result of democratic transition. It's not the result of a particular socioeconomic status. My read, and I have been to Cuba several times to do research, and I've asked people about the percentage of women in office. People have told me they do not have a formal gender quota. There is no law, there is no regulation that requires 50% of candidates to be women. However, I think being at the top of that list is a desirable place to be. And in Cuba, where candidates for the Congress of People's Deputies are chosen by the leaders of the Communist Party, they are very savvy in picking female candidates. What we didn't talk about is that the Cuban Assembly of People's, the National Assembly of People's Power, has, I think, 650 seats in it. It's a very, very large Congress. And it's a relatively weak Congress relative to the executive, relative to Raul Castro and before him, Fidel Castro. So holding position in office is not the same as being a member of Congress in the United States because of the limited powers that members have in Cuba. So that's another kind of institutional factor, is how much power do those parliaments represent and what does it mean to hold office? Also is a factor that can explain some of that variation. Thanks, Serena.
Lisa, there are a bunch of questions here about how students might get involved in joining or doing their own research on this sort of stuff. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is really quite distinctive about Dartmouth is our size and the fact that in most of the things that you will major in, most of the disciplines, we call them, that you will major in, professors are generally don't have graduate students, but have very active research agendas. So everybody in the science I'm involved in LALAC's Latin American Studies and in government is very actively pursuing research. So we have the best of, this is the teacher scholar model at Dartmouth, and we are in fact looking to work with undergraduates who are, really smart, really capable, really curious and intellectually curious and really motivated to be research assistants and to help us with the kind of work that we do. I'm trying to, there are a lot of different examples. So sometimes it'll work out that you've taken a class with someone and you kind of hit it off, and the professor is involved in a project and you're able to kind of get in as a research assistant to that person just on the basis of your relationship with them. We have a number of formal programs aimed at supporting collaborations between students and professors. The Presidential Scholars Program is one. There are lots of undergraduate research opportunities for you to kind of take your own research questions and develop them. And we provide various funds and support to do that kind of research on your own. So that's something that we pride ourselves on. It's something that I think makes Dartmouth quite distinctive. And in it's not for everybody, but in many cases, students and professors have actually published research together.
Awesome. And another one here, as a political science scientist and teacher, does your research lead to advocacy for change here in the US? Is that a focus of your coursework?
It's a really, really interesting question. I'm really glad that you asked it. You might guess from the topic of the research, or the topic that I talked about the status of women in elective office, that I am an advocate of increasing the percentage of women in political office. And I will tell you that as a political scientist, that is not the case. I am interested in understanding what explains the variation. Why are women hold fewer percentage of the spots than men? What impact do women have on office? And we could also flip that question and say, why do men hold 75% of the seats and women 25%? So I'm really interested in asking questions that we don't have the answer to, and doing the kind of research to help determine those answers, to help deliver on the results of the research. My interests lead me to ask certain kinds of questions over others. And certainly you can see in the kinds of questions that I ask, I have an interest in the status of women in politics. But I see myself as a researcher, not as an advocate. And I view my role as a professor at Dartmouth to create a space in my classes and in the research that I do for all political viewpoints to be heard. And I pride myself on having classrooms where we're talking about very controversial issues and things that people are often reluctant to talk about, especially with regard to gender, but creating a space in which we can talk about various points of view. With regard to gender, almost in every country around the world, issues about gender and the status of women are at the heart of political conflict. So to presume one perspective or another would really be to misrepresent the nature of the conflicts that are going on, and wouldn't get us very far in helping to understand them. So I think advocacy is really important, and I think I support that with students. But for myself as a professor, I view my role as facilitating debate, dialogue, and discussion.
Awesome. I think we have time for one more here, and there's a question from Ria Patel that dovetails nicely with that last one. And it's if somebody wanted to pursue public policy, what subfields in the Department of Government would be best to study?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. So I'm going to actually circumvent the question by saying, if you're interested in public policy and you come to Dartmouth knowing that you want to be a government major, that you should take an English class, or you should study poetry, or you should take computer science, and really push yourself off of what you see as your path, because that's what we do best at Dartmouth, and that's what I view a liberal arts education as doing. We are not a professional school. We will give you lots of training that if you decide to go into public policy, you will be very well prepared to do. But the kinds of skills that we will best teach you, and we will teach you to be best at, are skills that are really broadly applicable to lots of different careers. Those skills are writing, analysis, argumentation, public speaking, critical thinking. And what's liberal about the liberal arts is basically we give you a sense of skills and facility in lots of different topics. Rather than we give you some, when you major in a particular discipline, you do get some depth within that. But I would encourage you, especially coming in as a first-year student, to think about, okay, I know I'm interested in public policy, but I'm actually going to explore some other things. I can't tell you the number of times I've spoken with seniors who are graduating who took a class, sometimes spring of their senior year, being like, oh, if I'd taken that class my freshman year, my whole career would have been different, because they feel as a senior free enough to take the courses that they're really intellectually interested in. Whatever courses are intellectually interesting to you are going to get you the skills and the kind of bona fides that you will have as a Dartmouth graduate. And there are an infinite number of ways to get there. So when a student comes to me telling me they want to go in a particular path, my response is always, let me push you, let me show you these other paths that are open to you to explore. And I think that's one of the things that Dartmouth does best.
Awesome. Lisa, thank you very much. This was wonderful. Thank you so much for your time and for connecting with our students. Guys, if you have a question that wasn't answered here, feel free to shoot it off in an email, either to Lisa or to me, and I can connect you with her. Hope you enjoyed this. Over the rest of the week, we have presentations from faculty in engineering, economics, and math. So tune in if you can. And if you're unable to, realize that all of these presentations live on as recordings on the admitted student website. So thank you, Lisa, again. Thank you, everybody, and have a great evening. Take care.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.